Well, welcome everyone. We have a special video today. I'm very pleased. I have two former students that are joining me today who have gone far in their careers, and one person I've never met before, but I've always been anxious to make her acquaintance. We're dealing with three professors who are involved with the St. Bernard's School of Theology, which is in Rochester, New York. And we have Dr. Matthew Kuhner, who is the director of the theology program there. We have Dr. Lisa Lickona and Dr. Danny Drain, and they both are involved at St. Bernard's as well. I'm going to allow each one of them a very brief introduction of who they are, their credentials, and then we're going to get right into a discussion today, which is about Communio theology, the journal Communio. This is the 50th anniversary of Communio, and St. Bernard's is hosting a conference at the end of September on Communio, the idea, and there'll be various speakers there like Jean-Luc Marion, David Schindler, and so on. Well, let's start with you, Matt. Just give a brief bio of yourself to the viewers so they know who it is I'm talking to.
Sure, absolutely. So Dr. Matthew Kuhner, Vice President and Academic Dean at St. Bernard's School of Theology and Ministry, also Assistant Professor of Systematic Theology. I did my undergrad at DeSales University with you and Dr. Hauser and Dr. Stephen Laughlin, who's now President of St. Bernard's. And then I went on for my MTS at the JP2 Institute. And then after that, on to a PhD in systematic theology at Ave Maria University, studying under Dr. Mikhail Waldstein, writing on Balthasar, Hansers von Balthasar, on the theme of person and mission across various aspects of his work. Yeah, so what a gift that was. What a gift that was. And recently have been turning a little bit more to Matthias Shaben in my academic work and trying to do that in the midst of administrative responsibility.
Look at you, Mr. Fancy Pants, quoting Matthias Shaben there. Shaben is one of my, I cut my eye teeth on Shaben decades ago and thought I was the only person that paid any attention to him. Now all of a sudden he's all popular again. Everybody sees him as this sort of bridge figure between the Thomists and the Communio people. I don't think he is, but he's still great. Anyway, thanks for that intro. Let's go to Lisa Lickona, Dr. Lickona. Tell our viewers briefly. I feel like a game show host now on Password or something. Who do we have here? Who's this new guest? But anyway, Dr. Lickona, go ahead.
Thank you. Larry, I'm not a doctor. I hold a licentiate in sacred theology.
Oh, that's right. I always make the mistake of thinking that a licentiate is a doctorate, and it is not. It is not. So you have an STL, from the JP2 Institute.
Yeah.
But you went to Notre Dame. You went to Notre Dame, I saw. What year did you graduate? My wife graduated.
I am not going to tell you what year I graduated. Let me just say this. I was at Notre Dame when Dave Schindler was still at Notre Dame. He taught in the program I was in there. I knew him at Notre Dame, and I got to the Institute before he did. So okay. I actually have to tell you though, I'm part of that illustrious group of thinkers who hail from southwestern Pennsylvania. So
there you go, near Bedford, where Rodney Hauser's right, from Bedford.
Right.
Yeah,
I'm from Ligonier, Pennsylvania. Went to Notre Dame, went to the Institute for my master's and my licentiate. Then I took a long retirement, long sabbatical from theology and had a whole bunch of kids and an organic farm, and then got back to this a few years ago. I am super thrilled to be up at St. Bernard's. It's been an awesome ride so far. It's a great
You were an editor at Magnificat, because we get Magnificat, and I was trying to figure out where
that part.
Yeah, I'm trying to. I've seen her name before, and then I was reading your bio, and I thought, oh yeah, that's where I saw her name before, because she used to write for Magnificat, which a lot of our viewers are probably aware of. And now you are at St. Bernard's, and you're teaching systematic theology, correct?
I am.
What is your specialization?
Well, so I got two things going on right now. You know, my background with Magnificat, I was the editor for Saints, so I spent 8 years on a daily basis doing these dives into the lives of the saints. So I'm really kind of trying to go deeply into the theology and sanctity piece in a very practical way. And then the other thing that I'm really interested in, and I've done some writing on, is the idea of virginity in the works of Luigi Giussani. So that's my
fantastic.
Other piece.
Giussani. Well, I'm going to confer upon you an honorary Chappian doctorate here.
Thank you.
the Institute de Chappian blogosphere, whatever. So as long as you're on here, since I've already conferred a doctorate upon you, consider it an honorary doctorate. Anyway, thank you. On to Danny Drain, another former student of mine from DeSales University, BA there, PhD candidate at the JP2 Institute in Washington. I do know that about you. What else should our viewers know?
That's it. Yeah, I'm working on my dissertation on Hans von Balthasar and the relationship between finite and infinite freedom. So the question of the descent into hell. Writing on that under Dr. Nicholas Healy, while I'm also the coordinator of academic operations and lecturer in pastoral theology here at St. Bernard's. So part of a movement to present pastoral theology in a way that's ordered and structured. So for example, the courses I teach right now, I'm doing a class on eschatology, and in the fall, I'm doing a course on the Second Vatican Council that we're presenting in the language of the pastoral, but we're going to read the constitutions and do the history and the context. So we have a lot of shared concerns. Vivid memories of being your student. I was in your last lecture, which was a packed classroom. A lot of cherished memories from there. A lot of Chappisms that have entered, unfortunately.
Yeah, a lot of vulgar ones you can't say here. Most of which are
vulgar, that's right.
Yeah. I had quite the potty mouth not back in, still do, but I try to clean it up. St. Paul does says we shouldn't use coarse language. But, I adhere to modern exegesis, so we can't be fundamentalists about this, can we? So. That's all the rage now, not to be a fundamentalist about anything. But anyway, I don't want to go down that path. Not yet, anyway. Thank you, Doctor. Not you. Well, I'm going to give you an honorary doctorate. You're a PhD candidate. As long as you're on here, you're an honorary doctorate as well. Might as well. God, I was going to say something you said about finite, infinite freedom, descent into hell, Vatican II, and now it's all kind of watered out of my brain as it goes along. But those are all obviously very, very hot topics these days. So I wish you well. And I know what it was. You mentioned Nick Healy. You're studying under Nick Healy. Well, then you have a connection to Nick. Tell Nick someday, maybe it might be a good thing if maybe just once he could answer an email. That would be really good.
I may or may not be able.
I was talking with Mike Hanby about this, and Margaret Turek and Adrian Walker. They're all just laughing hysterically. Like, yes, you send an email to Nick, it goes into a black hole and never comes out. So I was taking it quite personally for a while until I learned that. But anyway, give my best to Nick if you're speaking with him. And I'm just kidding about the email. Please don't bring that up. Anyway, and I'm sure he doesn't watch these. He's too busy densely reading important stuff. So anyway, we want to talk about all those. I said before we went on the air, not a long intro, but this is great. It's very interesting to talk to all of you. So we want to talk about the fact that this is the 50th anniversary of Communio. And before we do, I just want to make mention, this will be the commercial aspect of this YouTube video, that St. Bernard's is hosting a conference honoring the 50th anniversary of Communio, which will be a conference, therefore, on what is Communio, what's its project, what's its ongoing significance. So I'm going to turn it over here briefly to Dr. Kuhner to briefly describe the conference, give us a list of who the speakers are, and what he hopes to achieve with the conference. And then if I was tech savvy, I could link something on here about how to sign up for the conference. Maybe my tech guy can do that for me. But anyway, go ahead, Dr. Kuhner.
Yeah, sure. No, praise God. What a gift it is to be at the 50th anniversary. Communio as a journal was founded in 1972 by De Lubac, Ratzinger, Balthasar, and others, right? And it actually was formed in a cafe in Rome, right, during an International Theological Commission meeting, which is sort of a neat historical moment. But we really wanted to sort of take time to savor the legacy that Communio represents over these past 50 years. 16 different language editions. I'm not sure if that's accurate anymore. Denny, you might know better than me.
Something like that. Now.
13 now. Okay, so 13 language editions at present, a worldwide phenomenon, right? And so I think in celebrating that, we wanted the keynote speakers to represent that worldwide international aspect. So we have two of the major founders of the French edition of Communio, Jean Duchesne, who was also, Dr. Chapp, the literary executor for Louis Boyer, which is phenomenal. Historical works on Boyer in French that just cry out for translation. And then Jean-Luc Marion, who needs no introduction as a philosopher, right, as a contributor to Catholic thought. However, I think his link with the French Communio is really interesting and perhaps lesser known. And then in the Italian realm, in the even the French speaking realm and German speaking realm as well, we have Father Jacques Servet coming, who is also the rector of the Casa Balthazar, who knew many of the founders personally. From what I hear, he did their dishes a lot as a young Jesuit, which is like phenomenal. Which means that he got to hear all the best conversations and best stories. So he'll be coming as well. And of course, Ratzinger himself was involved in founding the Casa Balthazar when he was prefect of the CDF, I think. And then we have Tracy Rowland, who's coming, who maybe is perhaps, from like a systematic theology perspective, one of the best examples of communio theology today. She's out of Australia, taught for a long time at the JP2 Institute down there, and now I think is at Notre Dame in Australia. And of course, her book, Catholic Theology, if you haven't read it, you should. It's just a beautiful synopsis. I think she has almost 100 pages on communio as an approach to Catholic theology.
Yeah, it's fantastic. I've recommended it to my viewers before. Tracy Rowland, Catholic Theology. It's not a title you can forget.
Absolutely.
And it's just, because seriously, and I don't mean to interrupt you, because I talk so much about ressourcement theology and communio theology. I do get a lot of emails from my viewers and those who read my blog about, okay, where do I go to read about the history of 20th century Catholic theology? And I can think of, there are a lot of books out there on that topic, but I think Tracy's is just lights out the best one that's out there right now on that topic.
Amen. Completely agreed.
But anyway, I interrupted you, so keep going.
No. And then the final keynote speaker is David L. Schindler, who, of course, has been so instrumental for decades and decades in the American edition, the North American edition of Communio, who, in a certain sense, his work and the work of Communio in an English-speaking context are almost intertwined in that sense. So it's a beautiful, beautiful thing to have him kind of reflecting on that. And so a lot of the keynotes will be actually reflections upon the legacy of Communio, and then also sort of the theological expansiveness of the Communio approach. That's wonderful. And then we put out a call for papers. So it's the conference is going to be constituted by these keynote lectures, and we'll have a panel of keynotes at the end, which will be really cool because they can sort of talk amongst themselves, and the whole group of in-person and Zoom attendees can sort of engage with the panel. But then we have a bunch of breakout sessions where we'll have multiple speakers in given breakout sessions. And we were really humbled and honored by the responses that we got. I mean, everyone from Dr. Rodney Hauser, Margaret McCarthy at the JP2 Institute. We have a number of papers on scripture. We have Jennifer Newsom Martin from Notre Dame, Michael Dominic Taylor, whose work I know that you enjoy, Dr. Chapp. So many wonderful people. It's a who's who. People would come to a conference just for the breakout speakers, right? The non-keynote speakers.
So I was see, this is great. I was not aware of who the breakout speakers were. So for example, I didn't know Hauser was going to be there or Mike Taylor was going to be there. So I'm giving a talk at Holy Cross College in Massachusetts right after the conference in Rochester. So I have to find my way up there. I'm going to have to attend this conference. So everybody out there, attend this conference. So obviously, people can just go to the St. Bernard's webpage, and there'll be a link there on how to sign up for the conference. Right?
Exactly.
And so it's just is it at stbernards.edu?
St. Bernard's, exactly. stbernards.edu. You can also just Google St. Bernard's and Communio, and the page will pop up. You can see the registration there. It is a hybrid conference, so you can attend by coming in person. And it's actually extremely affordable. Rochester is a great city to host the conference in the sense that it's relatively accessible, but also it's very affordable. So in-person attendance is pretty affordable. But then we also have the online. Every talk will be Zoomed. And so every classroom and breakout session will be blended in that sense.
Very good. That's excellent. That's a great introduction to the conference. I would go I would love to hear Jean-Luc Marion. And of course, I owe my career to two people. The late, great Ed Oakes and Dr. David L. Schindler. And so, I mean, Dr. Schindler, in a sense, Ed Oakes steered me through the dissertation process at Fordham and really charted me through some troubled waters there and in a department of liberal Rodnerians who hated Balthazar back in the day. And Ed, thank God he was a Jesuit and ran interference for me. But David Schindler, the elder, I mean, when I was a freshly minted PhD at Allentown College of St. Francis de Sales in 1994, I got a little grant from our Sunday Visitor Institute to run a conference on Balthazar in 1996. And it was not much money at all. And I thought, okay, nobody knows who I am. nobody knows where what Allentown College is, even though Allentown's in the name. It's like, where is it? Which Allentown? And so, how in the world can I avoid just getting a bunch of nobodies to show up at my conference? Just a bunch of my buddy friends where we smoke cigars after a talk and laugh at the 10 people that showed up. And so I thought, you know what I'm going to get David Schindler. And so I looked up the phone number to the Institute, and I just cold called his office, nervous as heck, sweaty palms. And I was not expecting at all for him to pick up the phone. I thought it'd be a secretary or something like that. And he goes, "Yeah, this is Dave Schindler." And I was just like, "Oh my God, what do I say now?" So, "Hello, Dr. Schindler." Hello. Oh my God. And I swear I probably made a fool of myself. But I got to the end of my spiel about the conference, asked him to be the keynote, and he said, "Yeah, sure. Sounds great." And that was, and then of course he brought the entourage up from the Institute. That's where I met Adrian Walker, his son, little Dave, and various other professors from the Institute. And from that point on, I had a connection with Communio in Washington, and I published in Communio. So I know that's more than my viewers even care to hear, as if they care about my life. But nevertheless, that's just a long-winded way of saying that David is a very generous man. And actually cares about more than just scholarship. He actually cares about helping young scholars who are in the Communio School of Theology to get a start in things. And I just wonder, I tell my story because, and I know both of you, all three of you have been influenced by David Schindler. How many young scholars do you think have been inspired in the Communio movement by the influence of David Schindler? You know, that's an open-ended question. I don't think we know the answer to that.
Yeah, that's a really interesting question, Larry. We were talking about that last week, just the impact that Dave Schindler has had. I have the same experience as you, and actually I think my experience predates yours.
Oh, please tell it.
No, because I got to the Institute in 91, and I worked as Dave's student assistant. I was his first student assistant, and I worked on editing his book, At the Heart of the World from the Center of the Church. And I was one of those, young scholars that he had gathered around him. So like at that time it was Adrian and Nick Healy and DC. And it was beautiful because that Communio is a real thing. It's not just and that's what we've been talking about so much with this conference. There was this, this genuine coming together, and there was always this there was always this openness to talking about things and to going deeply and to pushing things. And so for me, it was absolutely amazing, just amazing to be part of those conversations, and formative in every way. So I have the same experience.
Yeah, and I'm sure lots of people can tell similar stories over and over. And I think that's the true mark, not just of a scholar, but a theologian who knows he has an ecclesial vocation. Yeah. So why don't we use that as a springboard to discuss Communio and its history? Because I think a lot of the viewers would like to know. So, Dana, you haven't spoken yet. Let's shift to you. Let's spread the wealth here. And so what can you tell the viewers, say, about the history of why Communio got started in the first place?
Yeah, normally on the history questions, I tend to punt to Dr. Kuhner, so he's free to jump in here. Often what's discussed is the historical genesis of the journal in opposition to concilium, that there were two opposing movements that came out of the Second Vatican Council, and whether folks were on one side or the other, at some point it resolved into the Communio concilium split. For us, in preparation for this conference in particular, we've been revisiting, for example, the founding documents and any time that the Communio editors spoke about the journal itself. And it's so interesting how seldom they are to speak about themselves as being simply in opposition to, say, another journal. They almost never speak of Communio as a journal or an intellectual project simply, but as a means of, accessing what the Spirit is actually doing in history in this moment after the Second Vatican Council. So, Matthew, if you wanted to jump in, I'm just thinking of this idea of Communio as a tranquil center, but not as a center defined by its opposition or its middle place between two poles of progressive or conservative or something. Yeah.
Amen. So one of the things that we've been doing for your viewers, we've had sort of what we've been calling like this 9-month gestation period. We have this idea that because Communio is about communion among persons, right? And that's actually part of the Communio journal too, is it was never just meant to be read alone, right? In your easy chair. There are these Communio study circles that unfold from the actual subscribers, right? So you have study circles around the country and around the world reading this together in a community. So likewise, we thought, well, in preparation for this conference, let's take 9 thematic sort of trajectories that the Communio journal has tackled over the years. And let's just get a bunch of Communio articles together, pick someone to sort of lead it, give 20 minutes on it, and then just have a 2-hour discussion. And so we've been doing that. And the very first one that we did was all of the founding documents. So the mission documents, and they're in a couple places, right? There's Balthazar's Communio program. I think that's available as a free PDF on the Communio website. If you're really interested in the genesis of Communio, this is also a must-have. This is the fall 1992 edition of Communio, because in there, this is the 20-year celebration. It's got JP2's address to the leaders of Communio. It's got Ratzinger's article on the program of Communio, Kenneth Schmidt's, Jean-Luc Marion, and Antonio Saccari. So that's really huge. And then in the back, there's a couple of what I've been calling the espresso shots of the mission of Communio written by Balthazar. So literally like a 600-word mission, and then a little bit of like a maybe 1,500-word elucidation written at 2 different times. So when you read those documents, though, and I think just to the handoff point that Danny's making, when you read those points, there's a really lovely quote from Ratzinger's article on the founding of Communio that I just want to read here, because I do think that in the mind of the founders, they were less trying to respond or correct to concilium as sort of a polar response, as much as just responding to the lack of the proper form of theological and intellectual Catholic work, period, right? In the sense that it was actually there was a paradigmatic shift away from theology done according to the object, which is God, right, and the proportions of that object, and more so based on the formal categories of polarization, of conservative, progressive, things like that. So listen to this. This is a really moving quote here. Ratzinger writes, "Once theology was no longer being measured according to its content, but rather according to the purely formal categories of conservative and progressive, the learned man from Basel, Hans von Balthasar, must have seen very quickly that his own voice alone was not sufficient." Isn't that beautiful? Yeah. He's writing all these wonderful things at this point. And then that unfolds into this whole communal project of Communio. So it's not that the Communio concilium tensions are not real, or that the historical genesis, that's not an adequate reality, right? But nevertheless, I think it sort of is underselling the full scope of the project to say that it's simply contra concilium.
I think that's true. I'm just in Catholic World Report. I have a book review coming out probably on Monday on the republication by Ignatius Press of de Lubach's book on the Church, Paradox and Mystery. And one of the things that's interesting to me is that the original French edition of the book was written in 1967, a mere 2 years after the close of the council. And de Lubach is already in this text, waving a red flag and saying, whoa, wait a minute, wait, Poindexter, this is what the council said over here, and yet, now what's all of this goofiness over here? What's going on? And so he says, here's what we need to remember, and bang, 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 in typical de Lubachian fashion, we get these gorgeous meditations on various topics. Well, my point is this, I think it's well taken. Communio is founded in 72. And I think like de Lubach, when de Lubach was part of the founding of Communio, like de Lubach, Ratzinger and Balthasar and a few others who were involved in the ressourcement theological movement that bred Vatican II, were stepping back, and they weren't so much reacting to the Concilium journal as such, which had Hans Kung, Skillebex, Congar, Rahner up to a point, but I think even Rahner got fed up with it after a while. And I think Karl Lehmann maybe was in the Concilium crowd as well for a while.
I heard someone say that he was the only one that sort of formally double dipped.
Well, as I wrote somewhere, Karl Lehmann could not seem to figure out whether he was a Communio theologian or a Concilium theologian. And I still don't think he's quite figured that out. But nevertheless, those were the players. And so I think you're right. Communio wasn't started so much as a direct reaction against Kung, Skillebeck, Congar. Congar went nuts. But anyway, Congar, these guys in Concilium, as it was a more just the recognition of a deficit in understanding of what the council was about and the theology that led up to it. It's almost as if within a short period of time, the church underwent some kind of collective amnesia. Did we just forget everything we talked about? And so Communio rises to say, here's what we were talking about. Before we were rudely interrupted, here's what the council was about. All right. So that's my sort of armchair take on it. So let's get Lisa involved here, because you've been involved in understanding the saints and the importance of one of the central calls of the Second Vatican Council was the universal call to holiness and Lumen Gentium. It's one of my big hobby horses as a Catholic worker, especially. I would like you to maybe, if you don't mind, I don't want to put you on the spot. If you'd rather talk about something else, you can talk about something else. Maybe you could talk a little bit about the relationship between Communio as a theological project, which was rooted in a theology of communion that flows out of Vatican II, and the concept of theology as grounded in sanctity and as Balthasar would say, theology on your knees.
Right. Wow, we talk about this all the time here. Actually, at St. Bernard's, it's kind of like that essay, Theology and Sanctity, is like, I would say it's thematic for us as a school, and we've all been tremendously influenced by it. Yeah, I mean, I think, to me, this is kind of where my paper for the conference is actually going. I mean, I think this is an area where Communio actually can go a lot further with the piece on sanctity but for Balthasar, of course, this whole idea that that doctrine and life are not in tension, but they have to, but that the saint, the theologian saint, is really the person who manifests the truth of what it is to be fully engaged, both theologically and experientially. That's at the heart of what he's doing. And I think that, I mean, for me, it's been really interesting coming back to this after spending years with the saints. And it's just kind of reignited this excitement I have for Balthasar's theology, because I feel that he really kind of came on the scene and ignited something for the whole church and like a whole generation of young theologians who realized that this could be more than just an academic pursuit, right? Like, this is going to be a path that I'm on. And I'll just say one other thing. I was rereading. I was actually reading the beginning of the Book of All Saints, which is the Allerheiligenbuch. So that's Adrian von Speyer's first published in English, the first translated English aspect of her mystical, kind of those special mystical writings that were held back.
That's a wild book.
It is a wild book, but I have to say that when I was writing about the saints, I found that book, I would always read it after I'd researched a saint, because I didn't want to be like, start with a mystical and then move to the biographical. But I was always very struck by how Adrian's charism seems to really match up with what's actually happening in people's lives. But what I love about what he introduces there is the centrality of this unity of life and doctrine. And there's a statement that Balthasar makes about Maximus the Confessor, right? And we're always talking about Maximus the Confessor, and he says, when I first got involved with Maximus the Confessor, I was more interested in his life than his doctrine, which I thought was so fascinating. So I went pulled open my Butler's Lives of the Saints, and I was reading Maximus the Confessor, and I was like, gosh, this guy, he had he of course he defended the the two wills in Christ, right? And he lost his tongue and his hand, right? Because the emperor was so infuriated that they cut off his right hand and cut out his tongue. Eventually died. I mean, he's called the Confessor, but he really was a martyr in every respect. And I was so struck by this, because this to me is this reawakened for me what I absolutely love about Balthazar and the whole Communio project is that it awakens us to the reality of the call of the Christian. The martyrdom. It's really martyrdom is always the horizon, right? The cross is the horizon, I guess for me as a theologian, it makes me so much more engaged experientially in my life, right? In what I'm actually living right now, because I realize that that this is not just about, something that I teach people and I go home and I, have a glass of wine and kick back. It's really about my life, my relationship to Christ lived with complete intensity and seriousness. And so anyway, I mean that I don't know if that's a good answer to your question.
No, it's a fantastic answer
for me.
Well, I think that's. Does anybody else want to jump in at this point? Danny and all three of you. I mean, don't wait for me to ask a question. If you want to just jump in, feel free. So do either one of you want to add to that? Go ahead, Danny.
No, just one of the fruitful encounters that Lisa and I continue to have as faculty members vis-a-vis Communio and the saints is actually this insistence that David Schindler has been sounding for years. This idea, he's prone to say like success is not a gospel category, one of his best throwaway lines, right? But his larger point is that the life of each individual Christian, if you're going to talk about success or like the fulfillment of your life or living your vocation, right? Programmatically, paradigmatically passes through a crucifixion experience, right? The whole structure of Christian life mirrors Christ's life: creation, incarnation, death, resurrection, right? But we so often are prone to thinking that our life in this world won't also look like crucifixion. And then what I'm particularly interested in, what's it mean to say that Christ's descent into hell reveals something about the nature of human freedom, right? And that was first born as a line of reflection within the Communio journal, within Dave Schindler's thought. But it's so tied up with this idea that the saint is the true theologian, right? The saint is the one, through that lived union with Christ that often looks like suffering, that does not look successful, that even interiorly experienced is not warm and fuzzy and is difficult and is not always full of consolation, but often desolation, that too is instructive for the form of life of the Christian, right? So precisely in the same breath that Communio speaks about the universal call to holiness, it also wants to reflect on what is the mystery that Christ reveals to us through his passion. So it's both of those moments at once. It's such a fruitful and interesting place of encounter and discussion, I think.
It is. And it goes back to what Matt was saying at the very beginning, that one of the things that characterizes Communio theology is a recentering of theology on its proper object, which is God. But for a Christian, Christ is the exegesis of the Father, the self-exegesis of the Father. And therefore, the saint, who is the exegesis of Christ, becomes for us this very concrete Christological image. What it shows that, therefore, the Communio project is ultimately a very Christocentric project, involving a Christocentric theological anthropology as well. And this is one of the mainstays of ressourcement theologie, it seems to me, is in a sense going all the way back to a book that was of tremendous importance in my life intellectually, was de Lubach's book, The Drama of Atheist Humanism. And there were other people involved as well, Maritain and others involved in this project of saying that the 20th century is the century of humanism, but also the century of the greatest genocidal degradations of the human family we've ever seen. Why is that? And therefore, the church needs to propose a proper Christocentric theological anthropology rooted in sanctity, but that brings me then to the very concept of a Communio. The journal is named after, essentially, a Communio ecclesiology, the so-called ecclesiology of communion that flows out of the Second Vatican Council. So I'm going to go back to Matt. I'm going to ask you, what is a communion ecclesiology, and what sort of challenges did it face at the council? In other words, what were some of the alternative ecclesiological proposals, maybe even centered around a misunderstanding of the idea of the pilgrim people of God and so on? I know Mike Hanby had an article in the previous issue of Communio where he talks about this, and it was just brilliant. But anyway, go ahead.
Amen.
Matt.
Amen. No, that's so beautiful. And this is sort of going to connect with what Danny and Lisa have been saying, in this sense that I think the first thing to know about communio ecclesiology is this notion that communio does not begin with us, right? It's not something we generate from below, right? It's not firstly a human category. I know, bummer, right? Yeah. Exactly. So in this sense, communio, when you think about that in your imaginary, when you hear the word communio, you shouldn't think of a bunch of people sitting around in a circle or something like that. You should think of Rublev's icon, right, of the Trinity. It's the Trinity that is first and foremost a communio. And communio ecclesiology is about the participation in Trinitarian communio via the person of Jesus Christ, who himself is the communio of humanity and divinity in that sense, right? So it's communio all the way down, but according to a sort of participatory notion. And I think what's so beautiful, this notion of sanctity that we've been talking about, to me, what so characterizes the communio work in its founding documents, and then, God willing, communio ecclesiology across the board, is this notion that you don't pit the from above against the from below. So I've just emphasized that first and foremost, it's the from above. But the point would be this, and this is why we've titled our conference Catholicity as Gift and Task, is that it may be first something received. And the saint is always conforming themselves to the gift that they've received, right? They're always conforming themselves to the pattern of Christ, right? But it is also then a task that occupies the entirety of your humanity. It might, in some sense, break your humanity and its sinful incrustations, right, in this way. And also, it will require not bravado, Balthasar says, but Christian courage to actually deal with the other, who, as Sartre said, is often like hell, right? that is dealing with the person, you know? Yeah. And so the radicality of the received gift gifts us the form that then also represents a task or a responsibility. And so that communion then needs to reorder not only our individual persons, but as that overflows into the communities that we're a part of. So I think it's something that's very characteristic. And when you read Balthasar's essay, Communio Program, you really, really get the sense that he doesn't want this to stop in the chapel, right? But he has this whole vision that it moves from Trinity to Christ, to church, to Christian existence in every single nook and cranny of our existence in that way. So hence going back to the theology and sanctity piece. But to your point, I think it's really interesting because, de Lubac's book that you were referring to, Church's Mystery and Paradox, was written so soon. I think even in Ratzinger's text of the compilation of articles that he was writing for the German church after each session of the Second Vatican Council, in the 63, 64 reports, I think you can already see him changing tone and exhibiting caution. But what's important is he's already exhibiting caution, so to speak, to the right and to the left, right? The conservative and progressive, I think, in various ways, that there was pushback almost equally, right? Think of Lefebvre and then think of the sort of more radical dissenters to the left. So the communio ecclesiology of the council was, in a certain sense, being tugged at from both sides, as it were, both dissent in the sense of error, perhaps, but also in the sense of competing visions of what the council wanted to do. And I think one of those that's really key, and that has led to some confusion with Communio, is that right after the council, especially around the time of the founding of Communio, there was the People of God ecclesiology that was sort of competing with Communio ecclesiology for the sort of hermeneutical power or the hermeneutical interpretation of the council. And that People of God approach wanted to sort of accentuate perhaps more of a bottom-up approach, right, from below to above. In this sense, right, how do we recapture? The culture is so interested in humanism, right? So we need to, in a certain sense, look at the paradigm of humanism and see how the gospel relates to it. Whereas Balthasar's response to this, right, which is really interesting, actually says this, he says, a Christian is the paradigm of the liberated man. For us, Christianity is the only form of humanism that can be truly complete and thus meaningful for all. It is universal and Catholic. So just to say that, right, I think there you see a little bit of the People of God versus the Communio vision, the received gift firstly, and then a sort of Christian humanism in that sense, versus a kind of looking at human structures and then building upwards. But what Ratzinger talks about is that actually the People of God ecclesiology actually morphed into what was later considered a communio ecclesiology, right? They used the language of communio ecclesiology to refer to something more or less emphatically horizontal, which led to a lot of confusions. And I think that's why you saw the 1985 Synod trying to reclaim an authentic sense of communio ecclesiology. So if you look at the writings from that synodal report, you'll see them hermeneutically saying, no, the council's ecclesiology is a communio ecclesiology, And it's inclusive of a people of God, a horizontal emphasis. But first, we need to understand it as gifted via the person of Jesus Christ, right? In that way. So there's a lot of nuance, I think, historically there. And I think part of the Communio project is to sort of anchor that Second Vatican Council, the conciliar hermeneutic, but also then to be a living organ by which it's preserved, propagated, and extended. And so I think that's part of the importance, is to say, we're not just propagating a particular ecclesiological model or something like this, right? But we're actually propagating the gift of the Spirit in our age, that in a certain sense is meant to be transpolitical, above the sort of concerns of left and right. And that's the only way that we can really get beyond the polarization, is to look to the heart of the gift that's been given. So sorry, that was long, and there was a lot there, but yeah.
Oh yeah, I have some things I want to say to that, but I'm going to give the other two guests a chance. Let's start with you, Lisa.
There's a lot there.
Yeah, there is.
I just want to say that, I think this comes through in all those readings, that those founding documents that we were talking about, which I would say are just great reading for anybody who wants to know Balthasar, Ratzinger, like the heart of this project. They're like Matthew was saying, like, especially these short pieces, they're really easy to get into. But what I would say is that I think it's just an interesting aspect of, or it's a truth of this communio ecclesiology we're talking about, like this idea of communio, is that precisely because God has become man in Jesus Christ and taken on human nature in this way that makes him the liberated man, and through his self-communication of this divine life, right? There's a possibility of unity that, not a possibility, there's a reality of unity for Christians and for everyone, but we can see this and we can live out of this unity. And this is what makes us it gives us the capacity to be non-polemical, right? Because you can enter into any situation, and Balthasar, like in that one piece, Communio program, he makes it clear, right, with respect to everybody, right, in relationships with Judaism, and relationship with Protestantism, and relationship to Buddhism, whoever, the non-believer, the agnostic, the atheist, that when we enter that situation of encounter with that person, we can assume unity from the beginning, right? We have unity with this person already. So that's a starting point, as opposed to coming in with, okay, I've got a point to prove, or I've got to convince them, right? There's a fundamental theological, anthropological starting point that we receive in the person of Jesus Christ, so that we, that's where the tranquility comes from, but also the suffering, right? Because accepting that position is to accept, to bear the sin of the world, if that's what's demanded of us in any given situation. That's what you see in the lives of the saints, right? And given
Yes.
given any situation, right? Whether you're, Saint Therese stuck in your convent, or you're Ignatius of Antioch being eaten by the lions, or everywhere in between, right? There's a way in which I can be present to these people in this circumstance, in this communion with Christ, but that has to happen through my own kenosis, right? My own complete, my self gift, my gift of my own self, and my entering into that situation. So I think that this is really important. And I would say this is where, I think that when we talk about our conference and like what we want to bring forward with this idea, it is really about living life in the world. Really, ultimately, Communio, the trajectory, the whole idea was theology and culture, right? It wasn't just going to be, like
Right.
Ratzinger says, let's make sure it's not a conversation just among us theologians, right? We want to kind of break it open. But this is where the possibility comes from. What you were talking about, Larry, the Christology and the Communio ecclesiology. This is how we understand that possibility of entering the culture in this really, full way.
Absolutely. And Danny, I love that especially the bit about the culture, because I think this is an often neglected aspect of Communio, and we'll come back to that. Danny, did you want to add anything?
No, I'll jump in right in on that point. It's hard to follow after Lisa speaking so beautifully. One thing I've always appreciated, because I encountered Communio as a college student, in fact, sitting at your feet, Larry, at Communio study circles, hearing people talk above me, and then eventually I grew to that full stature, I think, and to appreciate those conversations. But picking up this line in particular from the council, from Gaudium et Spes, which is often criticized for being too optimistic, right? There's correctives, though, within Gaudium et Spes that are at the heart also of what Communio as a journal does when it enters into something like cultural critique. So let me just read this little snippet from the end of, this is paragraph 36 of Gaudium et Spes, this notion of the independence of temporal affairs. It says, if the expression, the independence of temporal affairs, so the world's autonomy, creaturely autonomy, if that's taken to mean that created things do not depend on God, and that man can use them without any reference to their creator, anyone who acknowledges God will see how false such a meaning is. But without the creator, the creature would disappear. And the Latin there is evanescat, will sort of fade into the ether. It's harsh, right?
Yeah.
It continues, for their part, however, all believers of whatever religion always hear his revealing voice in the discourse of creatures. When God is forgotten, however, the creature itself grows unintelligible, right? So on the one hand, there's this optimism of the council and this Christian hope, this virtue of hope, but it's also paired with this harsh, stark awareness that this structural forgetfulness of God that Communio has come to say very clearly is built into our culture, implicitly and it expresses itself in explicit ways, right, is bad for us in the sense that the creature itself grows unintelligible. So sometimes, when it's written about in more popular press, folks have talked about Communio as the authors who write for Communio sort of tossing bombs from the Communio bunker, right? As if our point is just to say that the culture sucks, right?
Yeah.
The spirit of that, precisely in the line of this unity of theology and sanctity of prayer and life, right, is that the creature itself grows unintelligible, and it's actually, in some sense, in some deep sense, a work of mercy to critique the culture along these lines of this is inadequate for a vision of the human person, right? Atheist humanism is bad for us. It's not just like a bad idea, right? So just to pick up those lines, the creature itself grows unintelligible. And the Latin there is obscurator, right? We can't see ourselves when we have this forgetfulness of God.
Yeah. One of the criticisms of Communio that I often hear from various people, many of whom are actually very sympathetic towards Communio, is that Communio is quite the opposite of what you just said, Danny. In some ways, they'll say Communio is too insular, it's too inward-looking, it's too inbred. They never engage the culture directly. If there's say Dan Brown's book, The Da Vinci Code, comes out, you'll never find somebody in Communio sticking their big toe into that pedestrian pool, something like that. And yet that's what a lot of people are out there reading. And so I would say, well, yeah, there's a reason for that, but I don't want to go into that. But now here you're saying, okay, there's another realm of criticism that says, oh, you guys, you're just always just throwing your little Molotov cocktails out there about the culture. So I suppose it's possible to be both insular in one sense, where you're not engaging the culture positively, which then leads to the idea that behind your fortress walls, you occasionally poke your head up, and toss something out and go back down. I think this is, I don't know. I go back and forth. It's a criticism that I think, I'm going to say this right out loud, has some merit, but it's also a criticism that's also profoundly wrong at the same time. Maybe you guys can help me untie that knot, as the Pope is so fond of saying.
Can I hop in just with a quote here, just to maybe raise the stakes a little bit, because the first point of our conference is like 3 goals to it, because as an academic institution, you can't help but having goals for things. So God help us. But the first goal is to appreciate the legacy. Then the second is to consider its sort of future and present trajectories. And then the third is to sort of reflect upon this question in a certain sense, which is what are the limitations, the failings of Communio over its history, right? And what's the nature? How has it lived up to the mission? And I think we take here a quote from Ratzinger at the very end of his own Communio program essay. And I just want to read it real quick, and then I'm not going to comment, but just maybe we can set the stage for responding to your question too. Ratzinger concludes his 20-year appreciation of Communio's legacy with these lines. He says, "Have we been courageous enough? Or have we in fact preferred to hide behind theological learnedness and tried too often to show that we too are up to date? Have we really spoken the word of faith intelligibly and reached the hearts of a hungering world? or do we mostly try to remain within an inner circle, throwing the ball back and forth with technical language? With that, I conclude, and with an expression of my thanks. Right? So he just lets that.
Oh yeah, I actually quoted that quote in one of my blog posts because I remember when I ran across it, I was like, "Wow, this speaks directly to what I was just talking about, and about the criticism of Communio." And here's Ratzinger himself, sort of raising a sort of related idea. But so, what do you guys say to that criticism? And it comes from people that are actually many times very Communio friendly.
Yeah.
But I don't know if they actually have a concrete sense of what it is they're really thinking, what it is they really mean by that, or if it's just a sort of vague, impressionistic sense that, let me put it this way: there is a frustration out there that Communio has not moved the ecclesial needle, and that the dominant voice in the church continues to be something that we've had to contend with for 50 some years. Call it a concilium sort of view of things, a false democratized view of the people of God, a false horizontalism in the church, which seems to be enjoying a recrudescence in the modern papacy. And I don't want to go necessarily down that path. And so it seems as if Communio has failed in some regards. Even after 25 years or 30 years of JP2 Benedict and all those encyclicals from John Paul and so forth, all it takes is the next pope, and the whole thing is suddenly once again amnesia. It's like de Lubac needs to come back and write another book, a la his one from 1967. And it reminds me, too, of an interview I did with Louis Ayres. You guys know Louis, who said, yeah, Ressourcement as a project has kind of failed. And he makes a similar point. And he thinks his prescription is that Communio theologians need to stop talking so much about past Communio theologians like a Bouillet or a de Lubac or a Balthazar, and they need to start taking up the project once again of retrieving the scriptures, the church fathers, the scholastics, and so on, and placing them in theological conversation with the modern world in a time that befits 2022 and not 1922. So anyway, that's a lot that I'm tossing out there. Maybe you guys can comment on that. So let's start once again with Matt, and then we'll do Lisa and up to Danny again.
Shoot, I was hoping me reading the quote would get me a deferment. I do think so. Maybe just one quick comment. Etienne Gilson has this great assessment of the dangers of a school of theology or a school of thought. Right. This notion that the next generation, so the greats themselves, are beholding the mystery directly. Let's talk about theology for a second. The mystery of God, right? They're beholding it directly. And from that contemplative moment, right, comes forth this majestic work of writings or of meditations or whatever. But then the disciples of that master or the disciples of that saint, for example, they no longer behold the mystery of God itself. They behold the work of that master, right? Which results in in their own work being contracted and not fitting the proportions of the object, okay, in that way. And I think that that's something that does not just apply to the Communio, quote unquote, school or approach or whatever. That applies to everyone. I mean, the Thomists, whatever.
Yeah.
Make sure you're seeing what Thomas saw. Make sure you're seeing what Balthazar saw, insofar as you can. And that requires all kinds of things, like intellectual chops, formation. It also requires prayer, right? Because if we believe that these men were theologians in the full sense in which we're speaking, you can't just ratiocinate about these things and expect to sort of understand those proportions of the object, right? So that's just like one point about the school and the dangers there. I think the second point is the project of Communio. I think it's quote unquote failure, perhaps, actually tracks with the grandeur and the splendor of its mission. I joke and I say that Communio wanted it all. I mean, in this sense, right? It's not just about, it's, Larry, something that you talk about frequently on your podcast, on these recordings, is the universal call to holiness. I think in that sense, the Communio, all of the things that we've been talking about have been presupposing this universal call to holiness. And that's what Communio wants to be a vehicle of, right? The Communio Journal is not the universal call to holiness, but it's a means by which the universal call can come forth. Hence why when Ratzinger is reflecting, if Communio has failed, he's saying, have we really spoken the word of faith intelligibly and reach the hearts of a hungering world. So the bar is really high, right? But I do think that the aspect of a critique could be this. One of the things that you see continually in these documents is, how is Communio in itself, its particular mission within the Universal Call of Holiness, supposed to do this? It's supposed to speak intelligibly, right, in response to uncertainty. And that's a theme that runs through, speaking intelligibly in response to uncertainty, not only theologically, but also philosophically, culturally, even politically, right? An intelligible response to uncertainty. How have we done that within the perspective of evangelization, the Universal Call to Holiness? I think that's probably the best way to kind of come at a critique, which of course you always say you'll fail. We all fail, right?
And it relates, to why I also think I said there's merit in this critique, but it's also profoundly wrong. And it's profoundly wrong to its roots, because the premise is false, that Communio theology failed and didn't move the needle. I was having a conversation. I drove down to Emmitsburg, Maryland, to visit my old friend Bill Portier, consulting editor at Communio. You all know Bill, retired now, and it's also my alma mater, Mount St. Mary's. And we were walking to our lunch at the Carriage House, and I was giving this critique. And Bill said, "Are you crazy? Of course, Communio theology has moved the needle. Of course it has, because everybody now has to take into consideration a Christocentric Trinitarian perspective on all of this sort of stuff." He says, you go back to the late 1960s and early 70s, you did not find many progressive theologians talking this language. But now even the progressives talk in this language of a Trinitarian, Christocentric anthropology and so on. And he goes, so yeah, maybe it didn't have the big success, woohoo, where, you won the day and and everything's now resolved and all questions have been answered. No, but it did move the needle. And I think Bill's right about that. And I think, so anyway, I interrupted. I wanted to go to Lisa and then up to Danny to sort of deal with this same question, because I think it's really a burning question of not just, did it fail? Did it not fail? Whatever. It has to do with the next generation of Communio theologians and what they're. And there's a priest out in British Columbia that he's writing a doctoral dissertation on Ratzinger, Father Harrison Eyre. He has a very popular podcast, Clerically Speaking. I've been on a few times, and he is very big on this idea of energizing an entire new young generation of Communio theologians. So this is why I'm sort of focusing on this question. Where have they been? Where are we going? Because I think it's very important. So anyway, Lisa, go ahead.
Yeah, no, this is great. I'm going to start with just a kind of a historical comment, because well, I was so struck when I came to St. Bernard. So to have the experience that I've been having, because I was out of theology for a really big chunk of time. And when I graduated from Notre Dame in the early 90s, I was looking for.
We finally got it out of you.
I know, study
early 90s.
So my thesis advisor at Notre Dame was Michael Waldstein. So this Matthew and I have this little interesting link over the decades, and I told Michael that I had read Balthasar and Adrian von Speyer under him. And I said, I want to study theology, and he was at a loss to tell me where to go. Really, he was really like, he had gone to Harvard, of course, and almost died.
Yeah.
And it was really interesting. So I found out about this brand new school that nobody really knew about, called the John Paul II Institute, and I read a little. I got some little flyer on them from somebody. I have no idea, because this was pre-internet. And I brought it to him, and I said, well, I'd like to go here, I think. And the only thing was that they were going to talk about theology and gender. And I was really interested in the gender piece. Okay. I was really interested. In fact, I kind of flirted with studying feminist theology. Michael quickly talked me out of that. But and he was like, yeah, okay. I think, he was uncertain. Okay, what's going to happen? Because the Institute at the time was at its beginnings. And it wasn't certain what the trajectory was going to be. And so anyway, that was me going off to study theology, coming out of Notre Dame. And then I look at what it's like now. It blows my mind. There's so many places, so many people. I feel, I just read Margaret Turek's book. And I was blown away by that. I was like, I can't believe this is out there. If this stuff had been out there when I was, like where was she when I was looking for a place to study, So I think a lot has happened, and from my perspective, that's
well, I agree.
And then what I want to say about moving the ecclesiastical needle, and I'm going to speak for myself here. I'm not the least bit interested in moving any needles. I don't think that's my job as a theologian. I'll be perfectly honest with you. And I'm interested in encountering Christ daily more and more through the Word, right? Not through Hunter Swan Balthazar or Joseph Ratzinger, and I think that's why Ratzinger's those words that you quoted, Matthew, are so essential for us, because it's always returning to the Word. I mean, one thing is I love about St. Bernard's is St. Bernard of Clairvaux. I mean, that guy was soaked in the Word. Like, you can't read a line from Bernard of Clairvaux without getting the scriptures. And that's really where I want to go as a theologian. But let me just say, I always go back to Communio. If I want to look up something, the first thing I do is look it up in Communio, because there has been the wealth that has come through that journal is amazing. So it's always a starting point for me. I always use it as a touchstone, and I don't think I'll stop doing that. I hope that hopefully I can even contribute to the conversation. But I really think it's important, and I think this is what was in the heart of the founders, not to get hung up on what's happening in the church. I mean, this is the thing we learned from doing history, right? Like when I started studying the saints, one of the first crazy ideas that I had that was immediately exploded by the lives of the saints was there's no golden era in Catholic history. Like every time you think, oh, if only it were like this time, you realize, no, everything was pretty awful then too. And so I really think that fidelity is the key, and living that, giving my whole self to that, and giving that to my students. That's how I approach everything as a theologian.
That's fantastic. I think that is such a great caveat about I don't care about moving ecclesiastical needles. And before we get to Danny, I'll just throw my 2 cents in here in this regard. I started my blog 2.5 years ago. I started it sitting at the end of my dining room table at the farmhouse on our farm blog, on our farm webpage, and I just started as a kind of lark. It's like, I have some ideas rambling around this old fart head. I just kind of like to say, I'll just toss it. It got started because I posted some things on Facebook, and some of my former students said, hey, Chapp, you should start a blog. And I said, oh, blog schmog. There's a million of those. And I don't even read them myself. I hate blogs. I don't hardly read any of them. And so I thought, why should I start one? But I thought, okay. So I cranked out a few things, and it went viral. And then 2.5 years later, I get people saying, oh, you've got enough subscriptions, you could like monetize all this. No, thank you. The point is this, that I think the reason why my blog sort of resonated with people is precisely because I didn't give a darn what, I was just writing what I thought was true. And here's what I think needs to be said. And here's what people are missing. And I didn't care who my audience was. As Adrian Walker says, Chapp, you just sort of created an audience. You didn't write to an audience. You kind of created one. And I think and it's not just me. It's other people have written similar things. So I think it's very true. Just speak what you think is true is what I think the task of the theologian is, rooted in your faith, rooted in your commitment to Christ and his church. And stop the era of the internet, the era of clickbait has just caused so many people to be so worried. Like I'm writing this book for Ignatius Press, and it's no knock on Ignatius Press, but I got their marketing thing in the mail yesterday. It's like, okay, fill this out. Who do you think the audience of this book is? I have no idea. What other sort of books are out there that might reach the same audience? I have no idea. You asked me to write this book. I didn't propose it to you. So you tell me who you think is going to. So this is, like I said, no criticism of every press, the Word on Fire people. My God, it's like a book this long that you have to fill out for them. Who's the audience? I don't know. Maybe I'll create an audience. So that's the point. It's just what's true. I just speak your mind as a theologian. I think that's the most important thing of all. And then too, with regard to this ecclesiastical needle stuff, I think that it's true that the Communio theology has affected the broader theology more than we realize. But on the other hand, it's not the point. I've got every Communio that's been published since 1972. And one of the things that struck me the other day as I was looking, they're not here, they're at home, struck me is that there's an entire theological education from A to Z contained in those pages. If all you did was read every single one of those issues, you would find truth and find your way in the faith. And I think that's a tremendous enduring value as well, whether it moved this needle or that needle. There they all are as a legacy to a certain way of thinking. But anyway, I've monopolized. Danny, you finally get to speak.
No, that's a good transition. That is my theological education. You lit the fire, and then I read every Communio I could get a hold of. I wanted to comment briefly. I got to work at Communio for a little while within the last decade. So I worked there like 2014 to 2016, 2017 as an assistant. And one of the very first things that happened was, to take us back in time a minute, Communio put out this summer 2014 issue on marriage, theological and pastoral considerations. Yeah. And this is not well known. And in fact, maybe I'll get in trouble for saying this, but at great cost to the journal, we mailed a copy to every bishop who's going to be in attendance at the Synod on the Family. So it's not for lack of trying. Insofar as you're even going to talk about a failure, like there's effort made concretely, both through like private and literally, like we have generated these reflections on the nature of marriage. Please feel free to take a look before you have this discussion. So not for lack of effort. I mean, it is.
And that was a noble effort, considering the fact that nobody from either institute in Rome or in Washington was invited to a synod on marriage and the family, which is, well.
Yes. Yeah. Many conversations. I was at the institute.
Let's not go down that rabbit hole, shall we? Let's not bicker about who killed who. Let's just move on and accentuate the positive. So,
yes.
With regard to your conference, with regard to Communio, and I think that's all. I'm glad you agree with me, Danny, that there's this entire theological education in the Communio Journal.
Yeah.
I have a regular reader of my blog, an older gentleman named Cyrus Brewster, who lives in Connecticut, who he was not a theologian. And one day I think he showed up at the Communio. I think the story tells me he showed up at the Communio headquarters in Washington. And I think essentially he paid for all of these mimeographed Xerox copies of all these old issues of Communio. And he then proceeded to educate himself. And now he's one of the most brilliant theological minds, I think, out there. He and I communicate all the time. So Cyrus, if you're listening, here's a shout out to you. By the way, I need your garlic powder. He grows garlic. He sends me garlic powder. So that's good. He's great.
I just want to say, if it's all right, I just wanted to say, with respect to our mission at St. Bernard's in particular, of course, it's the case that we're all teachers, we're all professors in some sense. Larry, you retired from teaching. I think there's a whole world we could talk about there of and what I want to broach is this idea that, the council's theology doesn't get implemented necessarily by theologians in the classroom. And even just to speak for the three of us here at St. Bernard's, it's not our ideal to be like ivory tower researchers who just publish things. Like we have a deep desire. We're a school of theology and ministry. And the and ministry isn't just tacked on. It's theology and ministry is of a piece, right? And why does that matter? I mean, we don't all need to teach theology to live the universal call to holiness. And I think that's one of the great sort of growing pangs after the Second Vatican Council is this trajectory of lay theology or lay people interested in theology equals you have to go into academia to move the ecclesial needle in the church. That's precisely not the case.
I seem to have introduced a real new phrase here, ecclesial needle. So I'm liking the fact. Anyway, I'm sorry. Go ahead, Danny.
And we all know this from our experience in these Communio study circles, that the most interesting people and the most interesting things said are from the non-philosophers and non-theologians, and often from the stay-at-home moms. I mean, to speak very directly, like that's who Communio is for. And that's who, by the way, tends to really love it. In our discussions here at St. Bernard's, one of the most interesting people that contributes is a musicologist, a professional musician. She's got the most amazing things to say, right? This is universally the experience of when you take theology and philosophy seriously, and yes, it's presented under the guise of an academic journal, but it does change and form hearts. But that doesn't also mean that we all have to pursue jobs in academia. Each of us has a very personal and convoluted story of like, when we decided to either get back into or commit to theology despite the cross that it is, right? I think that's a commonality to Communio thinkers, right? Think about von Balthasar deciding for chaplaincy. Think about Ratzinger's horror at being elevated to the papacy, right? There's a constant there.
Yeah. Balthasar never held, strictly speaking, a professional academic post. And I mean, you're talking my language. I mean, people often ask me why after 20 years, you're full professor, tenured, publications, blah blah blah, the whole thing. You were sitting in a tub of butter, and you had this cushy little professorial lifestyle. Why all of a sudden did you decide at age 53 to start a Catholic worker farm? Well, there's why. Because I don't think I was called to just sit in a tub of butter, and I think I was called. I just felt, and John Gribowich and my wife Carrie at the same time coming together of a feeling that God was asking us to move out of the classroom, not to move out of theology, but to move out of the classroom iteration of doing theology. As it's certainly not the only way. And you know, as you know, you and Matt used to come to the Communio study circles that Rodney Hauser and I ran while at DeSales. I mean, the genesis of those things, it mirrors what you're saying, Danny, is that we started those things just, you know, because, okay, it's a thing. And I think partly, too, we wanted to have our names in the back of Communio as young scholars trying to make our way. Hey, look, there we are. Our names are in there. But also because, okay, it's something to do. And it started off as just 4 or 5 professors sitting around somebody's living room talking about, and mostly just theology and philosophy dudes sitting around talking Communio. Then we invited a couple of other professors from other disciplines, and they were very interesting. But then some students got wind of it. And so by invitation only, we started inviting our better students to join us for Communio. So then all of a sudden, now we're talking 10 or 12 people. Then all of a sudden, those students, and this goes to show, you know, the vitality and the power of a Communio vision of things. Those students started to come to Rodney and I and say, how about, we've got all these friends who are interested. They've had you guys in class. They would love to come now. So we started opening it up to any interested student and faculty member. And then you guys saw the result. Not at all unusual to have 40 and 50 people jammed into my living room or Hauser's living room. Just sit around and listen to a bunch of eggheads talk about Communio theology and articles, followed by, you know, a social hour that went until 3 a.m. and so on. But the point is, go back to what you said, Danny. I was always struck by the fact that in the midst of these conversations, usually dominated by Hauser and me, blah, 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 talking like we know everything, especially Hauser, so full of himself. But anyway, I digress. So he, all of a sudden, somebody would raise their hand, and it would be sometimes somebody I didn't even know their name, like you said, either a stay-at-home mom or a business major or somebody like that. And they would then extemporaneously start speaking, and you would sit back and say, I've been 2 hours trying to say what you just said in 30 seconds, most brilliantly. So going back to what Lisa was saying, you're saying the idea that we have to sort of keep this in the classroom is precisely not what Communio as a project has ever really been about. It needs to go out. But anyway, anybody, Matt, do you want to add to this?
No, and I was just going to say, I mean, you know, it's always hard to, because when you're talking about whether something failed or not, you're in a certain sense importing the language of some sort of measure. And it's really, really hard to measure whether or not the seed that must fall in the ground and die is bearing fruit. You see what I mean? In that sense, it's really, really hard to measure that. And I think in that sense, that's what we're talking about. We're not talking about how many academics are in high places, right, within the major Catholic universities and theology departments. We're not talking about, you know, how many books are published per capita every year that are of a Communio bent or something like that, right? We're talking about the word of faith being received in hearts, right, in persons, by persons, to have their persons lit up with the form of Christ, right, and to bear that splendor. So I think in that sense, it's always hard to measure. And that's not a cop-out from any sort of criticism, because I think what leads to that splendor being shared, or the seed falling into the heart, dying and rising, in some sense is a return to the sources. So just to link up with what we're saying, right, that in a certain sense, it's an encounter with the primal source of all things, right, capital S, but especially the sources identified by the tradition, right, the scripture, the fathers, the doctors. I mean, encountering those sources are the things that, in a certain sense, I think lift up everybody, from the grandmother reading for personal enrichment to the student with tons of philosophical chops, right, that are coming right out of undergrad or whatever.
Yeah.
All of it, you get lit up with the sources. And I think that's Lewis's point, I mean, that he was saying, but I think that's the key with the criticism of schools and the criticism of things like that, right? Help people. We are sort of handmaids, right? I mean, the theologian is a handmaid. This is sort of the Marian dimension of theology. You're always gesturing towards the mystery. You literally have, your student being presented as a friend of the bridegroom, right? That's what you are, right? Your student and the bridegroom are coming into communion, as it were. And that's sort of the point. And you do that best by just driving and revealing the sources to the student, I think. And that's then how you get that unmeasurable seed to fall, as it were, into the heart. It's not something that you do. It's not because of your own education. It's not. So anyway, does that make sense?
No, it makes perfect sense. I think that's so beautifully put, that it's the planting of a seed. And when the seed dies, what's the metric for determining what that seed has done and what it has wrought? I think that's very true. And I also think that a lot of the critics of Communio miss that point. Not all of them, but I think some of them miss that very point. And I also think that, I've discovered this since I've become a relatively popular, blogger and YouTube. I mean, very in a small pond, in a very small pond, is that everybody's always trying to adjudicate for you what your audience should be, what your mission should be. Here's what you need to be talking about. Mm-hmm. Here's what you should be doing. All that other crap you've been doing is okay, but here's the other stuff you should be doing. And I think that's true a lot sometimes with Communio, that people read it and say, well, this is brilliant. This is great stuff. But have you ever thought about doing this over here? And maybe you should be doing this. And but you can only do so much. And if you start trying to do everything, you end up doing nothing.
Isn't that the heart of Balthasar's theology of mission, is that you have to accept the mission and you enter into it fully. And it could be a gigantic mission or a small mission, but it's the level at which you're willing to embrace it that determines the fruitfulness, right? So it's not, I don't know, I don't think, because I know you could look at Communio and say, well, it's only got X number of readers, or X number of subscribers, but I don't think it's like what you were saying, Matthew. I'm just saying, I love the organic. I love that you brought that up, because that's actually the word that Balthasar uses. Is he says Communio is organic, and I think you can go all the way. So you can take this to your farm, Larry. You can go all the way with that and say, what does that mean? Is that you see this with any plant, the seeds go out there and they're all over the place, and you might not even know where the seed ended up and a plant sprouted up. So I think I'll just say, on a practical note, I was reading Angelo Scola's memoir, and it's really interesting to read his take on the Communio founding and the interaction there between Communio and communion liberation, right? Which is a movement that I'm part of, and it's so striking to me because there is clearly all this cross pollination going on that I can still see bearing fruit in communion liberation, right? From Balthasar. Right.
Oh yeah.
But that was years ago, and nobody's around saying, "Hey, this is where that came from." But so, I think it's really we like you were saying, Matthew. There's no measurement possible here. We just kind of have to trust the work of the Spirit and go with that.
And I think too, along those lines of organic, is I think some of the criticisms arise from the fact that Communio needs. Obviously, if you go and read the Communio Journal, I mean, it's highfalutin scholarship of world-class caliber. Read one David L. Schindler or D. Schindler article or whatever, and your head is spinning with the always, already, this, that, and the other. Gift X is not Y, blah blah blah, and it's like, okay, Schindler. In fact, our common friend Julia Buderbaugh now, but Julia Vidmar back in the day, before she went to the Institute, she took an independent study with me at DeSales. And I said, all we're going to do this semester is read David Schindler articles from Communio to prepare you for Schindler-esque speaking. And she says, Larry, that was the most valuable thing that anybody ever did, was to prepare, because I was in class in David Schindler's classes with all these fellow students who were going, what's he? Wait a minute, what's he talking? And then I knew exactly what he was talking about because I knew his language. But that's not a knock on David Schindler. He's actually just speaking in the language of a certain kind of metaphysics. And here's my point. Like Father Harrison Eyre, who I mentioned earlier, one of his points is that Communio moving forward obviously needs to retain its deeply scholarly core, the David Schindlers, the Jacques Servais, those sorts of people. It needs to retain that. But if Communio is in need of anything, it's in need of translators. And in fact, I think one of the reasons why Hauser and I did what we did at DeSales is that we self-consciously viewed ourselves as mediators, as translators of this scholarship into this undergraduate classwork. And one of the things that I think our experience proved, and the experience of other people like Robert Barry up at Providence that comes to mind, and others, is that you can do that. One of the great, I think, authentications of communio theology on the scholarly level is that you can translate it for a lesser, if you want to put it that way, audience, a non-scholarly audience. It is translatable. And when you translate it, it is powerful. It is uniquely powerful, which I think speaks to it. So maybe, and I'll just toss this out there, and we're kind of running out of time, but we can talk for as long as I want. But, it's maybe the way forward. We need to emphasize more the need for translators. Mm-hmm. What do you think about that?
Can I make a claim? Because then I want to hear sort of what Danny and Lisa would say about this, because it's part of the St. Bernard's context. Is I think that there's no greater answer to the problems in seminaries, perhaps, than, in a certain sense, the communio approach to theology when lived to the full by not just the professors, but the formators. I mean, in this sense. And I say that after years of being here at St. Bernard's, where we talk about the fact that we don't just do education, but we do formation, because we form permanent deacons, we form priests, right, through a pre-theology program. And then who
need to be translators.
Precisely. And I think in that sense, why is that? Because I think because of all the theology and sanctity stuff that we've been talking about, right? That in a certain sense, the four dimensions of formation as an integral whole, right? The human, the spiritual, the pastoral, the intellectual. The communio approach, with its return to the sources, with its interdisciplinary sort of mode at times, it has the capabilities of establishing a vision in which that formation can be achieved, and then the practical means by which it can be achieved, right? In that way. But also there's this emphasis, and I think this gets back to this notion that we have to achieve a serene or tranquil center in order to sort of move beyond the polarizations in the church. That the only way to achieve that center is to sort of elevate the center, right? It's not just a mean between extremes, like you see the trads or something like that, and you see the progressives, and you sort of plot yourself on a map in between. It has to be an elevated center that comes from everything that we've been talking about, right? The confirmation to the gift received, to the person of Christ in that way. And what that means is if you're patterning your life upon the life of Christ, you will achieve integral wholeness in your humanity, right? In the specifics in that sense. And that's something that I think the communio approach safeguards. It's not just about achieving spiritual contemplation. It's not just about achieving intellectual rigor. It's about achieving integral wholeness so that you can dwell in that tranquil center and therefore not defeat the polarizations, but transcend them in a certain way in order to live into that transpolitical reality. So that's the claim that I would make, practically speaking, is that I think, and you see this with Margaret Turek. She's now academic dean at St. Patrick's in Menlo Park, right, which is a full-blown seminary and university. You see it with Father Barron when he was at Mundelein, right, and the influence there. Father Pisarcik, St. Charles. So I think there's just a lot going on here with regard to communio and seminary formation, and just formation in general, right, for lay ecclesial ministry.
And Monsignor Michael Heinz at Mount St. Mary's. Mm-hmm. And then you've got guys like Keith Lemna out at St. Meinrad's. So anyway, I think that's a great point. A great point about seminary formation and translators. And you guys are all involved in ministry. But Lisa and Danny, what say ye about sort of the point Matt was making and the point I was making about the need for Communio to have translators?
Gosh,
especially people in ministry formation, people in ministry formation. Go ahead, Lisa.
I hope I am a translator. As you were saying that, what occurred to me was how, I could be, I have such gratitude for my education, which we all do. And as we've been talking here, I'm in more and more in awe of what I've received and the people that I've received it from. But I would say that what occurred to me was my experience reading Unless You Become Like This Child, right? And then the conversation that emerged in Communio, in the pages of Communio, and what's actually going on at the Institute about this, what does this mean? This to become a child become a son in the sun, and all the dimensions of childhood, right? Looked at that theologically and philosophically speaking. And I realized that has entered into my understanding of who I am and the way I teach, right? So that this is just to talk about this idea, right, is something that's very natural for me, and that I want to introduce my students to. Because why? Not because it's a cool idea, right? Because this is a way to live the Christian life, right? This is the way the Son lived, in vis-a-vis the Father, and this is what I want to introduce them to. And I did a lecture just last night and found myself talking about this again, and I guess I would just say that that's the work of translation is both the reading, right? Because we have to, as theologians or students of theology, that's what we do, right? We read, we study, we want to more profoundly penetrate this knowledge, but all for the sake of changing who we are, so that when we go back and communicate this to someone else, we're communicating a fuller reality that's being expressed through our flesh, right? That's being expressed in new and unusual and different and unique ways. So I guess what I just want to say is that, I think that you're absolutely right. Like, it's the translation, and we are the translation. We are the translation. Yeah,
we are it. We're it. Nemo dat quod non habet. You can't give away what you don't really own.
That's right.
And so yeah, if you have to have a foot in both worlds, both in the scholarly world and then in the world of formation of those who are going to go out and bring this stuff to the world. That's not easy to do, but it's possible. Anyway, Danny, your thoughts, and then we're running out of time here.
Yeah, so just to say, there's no greater joy as a teacher than to not assign an author, but to teach in the vein of that author. Like Matthew and I in particular, we teach almost nothing but Balthazar, but very rarely by assigning him. And there's a great joy in having a student then go on to read a little bit of Balthazar and come back to you and say, hey man, I see what you were up to. You just didn't. None of that was original. But think about that in the context of if you said it to Christ and you were like, dude, I met the Father. You're just saying his stuff. He would be like, yes, you get it. Now you've seen. Right. But that sense of mediating the form that is greater than I, right. I he who sees me sees the Father. That's a sort of Christological model of teaching that emerges in the Communio school.
I remember once teaching at an intro to theology class at DeSales, and I gave some lecture on Christ or the Trinity or something. And it was sort of straight out of Joseph Ratzinger's Introduction to Christianity. And I had sort of mentioned the book in passing at some point. So 2 months later, one of the students in the class came up to me and said, so you know this Joseph Ratzinger guy, right? I've never heard him before. He says basically everything you were saying. Yeah, it's the other way around. But it's very much the other way around. But yeah, so thank you. I said, thank you. But anyway, thank you all for joining me here today. But before we do sign off, Matt, I just want you to say to our viewers, how are the subscriptions coming for the conference? How successful do you think it's going to be? Does there seem to be a groundswell of people signing up?
Absolutely. Yeah. Praise be to God. Subscriptions or whatever registrations are really, really healthy. And we've got a really good segment of Zoomers, right? Zoomer attendees, but then we've also got a really, really wonderful segment of in-person. And that's one thing that I'll say is, judging by the amount of in-person, I think we've already got 70 people coming in person. And so the conversations that are going to happen, as much as the keynotes and the panel presentations are going to be great, think about the hallways, right? Think about the gathering areas, think about the meals that will be celebrated, because that's one of the points about Communio. It's not just about what happens, everything we've been talking about, it's not just what happens in the classrooms or the lecture
right
hall, but it's in that communion.
I'm going to make a confession, which is I never liked going to academic conferences. And mainly because I can't stand sitting through academic papers. And it's not that I think I'm so smart I don't need to hear anything. I just by the end of one, I just want to gouge out my eyes with knitting needles because it's an hour and a half of listening to somebody read at you. But to me, the number one reason for going to a conference, I know this is just me, not other people, is precisely what you just described, the sort of networking that goes on, the conversations that go on when the talks are done and over. And I'm not trying to insinuate that people should not listen to the talks at your conference. I'm just saying that for me, that was the goal of going to any conference. And so you've actually convinced me that I need to show up in person, especially since just a few days later I have to be in Massachusetts anyway, giving a lecture. So I think I'll definitely come up. But so the viewers also know, practically speaking, that means people are going to have to, if they want to show up in person, they have to make hotel reservations in Rochester. Is that the deal?
Exactly. And we have blocks of rooms reserved. So if you go through the registration process through the page, you'll get a note about how to do that. It'll all be sort of taken care of in very simple steps.
Very good.
Point, what's going to happen? I mean, we already have, because we can see who's registering their institution affiliations. We have a lot of catechetical leaders coming, which is really, really cool and hopeful, that we have a lot of people engaging.
Right.
Who are on the ground, who are doing this work, unfolding it in high school classrooms and parishes, things like that. And then finally, it wouldn't be a true Communio conference if we weren't going to actually live communion with God. So in that sense, we'll have Mass, morning prayer, evening prayer, exposition and adoration, and a compline at night by candlelight in our chapel, which is really the most lovely experience. So that's
compline is my favorite one of the hours. So that's going to be.
Oh, it's just great.
Sold me.
It's just great.
And
if you want to, so again, just Google St. Bernard's and Communio Conference, and you'll find us. And there's actually a list if you want to see the core group of the community that will be there. Everybody from St. Bernard's, everyone from our faculty and staff will be there. But then also you can see the keynote, a little bit of their bios, right? And then also you can see a list of the breakout presenters, so you'll know who are going to be there in person. So check it out.
And beyond the conference, one last thing I'd like to say, I often get emails from people, private messages. Dr. Chapp, I'm thinking about going on for advanced degrees in theology. Where can you recommend? Well, I would not have well, let's put this way. I do recommend St. Bernard's. And I think it's one of the best places going right now for getting a master's degree in theology. So there's that. So please do that. So thank you guys for this conversation today. I thought it was fantastic. It's one of my longer ones so far. They keep getting longer and longer. I don't know why that is. But anyway, I'm going to hit stop record right up here. People know I'm such a Luddite. Here I'm doing this slick YouTube video and I have to look up at my corner. Okay.
Thank you, Larry.